Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the British Columbia Museums Association's webinar. My name is Lorinda Calvert, and I will be your host for today. Today's webinar topic is Emergency Salvage of Art and Archival Collections, presented by Tara Fraser of the Vancouver Art Gallery and BC Hearn. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the BCMA offices are located on the traditional lands of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. We are grateful for the opportunity to live and learn here in mutual respect and appreciation. We also recognize the traditional lands of the many nations across British Columbia where the work of the projects described in this webinar have been carried out. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank our webinar sponsor today, Lucidia. Lucidia is a software solutions company based in Richmond, BC. They develop collections management software systems that are suitable for libraries, archives, and museums, both large and small. Lucidia's motto is redefine how knowledge is shared, which is quite fitting for our webinar sponsor. We thank Lucidia for supporting BCMA as we seek to share knowledge through our webinar series. As I mentioned, I'm Lorinda Calvert, your host for today. I am also BCMA's programs coordinator. I'm still new to Zoom, so please bear with me if there are any technical challenges. If you are experiencing technical difficulties, please do email our office. Vanessa, our operations manager, is standing by to assist. A bit of housekeeping before we begin. If you are reading this slide and hearing me talk, you are doing great. If you can't, don't shout at your screen because we won't be able to hear you. Simply use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. It may be hidden, so if you hold your mouse either at the top or bottom of your screen, the feature menu should emerge. Use this chat feature to ask questions or make comments, and we'll read your comments or questions out to the host. We do ask if you are able to save your question or comment to the end, that is preferable, and we've saved time at the end of this webinar for a Q&A. This month's presenter is Tara Fraser from the Vancouver Art Gallery and BC Hearn. Now, Tara, over to you.
Thank you, Linda. Let's see what we got here. Okay, well, thank you very much, and good afternoon, and welcome to everybody for joining me. This is the third and final webinar in a series of 3 that were produced and delivered by the BC Hearn. If you were fortunate enough to watch the first 2, a little bit at the front of this webinar will be a bit of a review. If you were unfortunate and didn't get to see the first 2, Lorinda will be sending out an email after this, and there'll be links to the recordings of the first 2 webinars. These webinars are intended to provide an introduction to the emergency salvage procedures in an emergency. In this course, and sometimes, it'll act as a bit of a refresher course, but it's also an introduction to some of these pieces for you. In the previous workshop, wait, we have a technical difficulty here. Okay. In previous webinars, you met Casey Lee. Casey is the senior conservator at the Royal British Columbia Museum, where she's worked for the past 16 years. Casey specializes in objects conservation. She received her Master's of Art Conservation from Queen's University in 1990. Since then, she's participated in numerous emergency responses involving a variety of collections and institutions, as well as historic sites. Casey has been on the BC Hearn Steering Committee since its inception. My name is Tara Fraser. I'm head conservator at the Vancouver Art Gallery. I also attended Queen's University in 1990, Master of Art Conservation, and I specialized in paper. I've been delivering disaster response workshops for museums and archives in North America, and I've written many disaster plans for many different types of cultural collections. Today, I'm going to speak to you about the salvage of archival materials as well as fine art. But before we begin, the activities of the BC Hearn are funded in part by a grant from the Government of Canada, the Museums Assistance Program. I also want to make a shout out and appreciation to Anne Deplanche, who's a private conservator here in British Columbia. Anne has been part of the BC Hearn steering group and is also now currently a leader in the North. Anne collaborated and developed these 3 webinars, and her assistance was absolutely invaluable. Thank you, Anne. BC Hearn is an acronym for the British Columbia Heritage Emergency Response Network. It's a collection of allied cultural workers across the province. It's a growing interconnected people through training and membership. The main goal of the BC HERN is to increase emergency response capacity and the confidence at a local level all across the province. The BC HERN was born from an identified lack of unified support for disaster response and collection salvage in the province. Several disasters actually occurred in a short period of time. These included a flood at the Museum of Anthropology and a fire at a remote Indigenous cultural center in BC. In light of these and a growing risk to collections resulting from climate change, the group of conservators began to collaborate over the past 6 years and created the BC HERN. BC HERN has come a long way and has managed to deliver many workshops on collection salvage to BC conservators and also to the broader community of collection care workers. They've managed to build and create 4 emergency salvage kits. And very importantly, we arranged to have a statement of cooperation signed amongst the 6 largest cultural institutions in BC. This letter of cooperation, and I quote, ensures the existence of a safe and rapid salvage response to emergencies that may impact heritage and cultural collections. We're also thankful to be partnered with the BCMA, who's presenting these seminars and hosts our webpage. So whether or not you join us at the BC HERN, you now have access to emergency response and salvage supplies, to online resources, to training, and professional advice when you need it. At the end of this, I'll talk a bit more about how you can join the BC HERN. This webinar now will present information and resources that will guide you through collection salvage. We'll talk about archival materials, library materials, and works of art. But before I begin that, I just want to make a couple of points. And one of them is, if you're looking for instruction on emergency preparedness, you need some training, perhaps you want to attend a workshop or a manual, don't forget that the Canadian Conservation has all of this available. They are also available 24/7 should you have an emergency. The number is posted in the bottom right corner. The other thing I want to remind you all is, and something very near and dear to our hearts these days, are the use of personal protection equipment. You need to remember that health and safety are more important than any collection material. So in the event of an emergency or disaster, your health, not just your physical health, but also your mental health, is very important. Yours and the rest of your staff and all the people involved in the response and recovery. Your safety equipment and supplies needs to be on hand, on site, but we also recommend that you purchase or put together a grab-and-go kit. This you could take with you whenever you have an emergency or you have to respond to any type of event. Lucinda is going to actually send you a list of the contents after this webinar is over. So when it comes to collection-related emergencies, we've noted that they can generally tend to unfold in a predictable fashion. A timeline of sorts can be visualized, and it can be highly compressed or extremely delayed, depends on the circumstances. But history does tell us that normal operations that you had at the beginning of your emergency are never quite the same at the end. During initial response, we are on site, and a lot of times you might even have to wait for permission to get into the building, but you're there to secure the building and mobilize the rescue team. This process can sometimes take hours, but sometimes it can take days, depending on the severity of your emergency. During the orientation phase, you're going to complete your assessment of the site and the collection. And you're going to plan for salvaging as well as documenting the entire collection. That's been affected, of course. You will also want to retrieve your emergency supplies, the ones that you hopefully have stowed on and accessible on carts. During the stabilization phase, it's where we will triage our collections. We're hoping to halt or even reverse some of the damage that has occurred. and we're going to include drying, perhaps cleaning, things like that. This process can take weeks, even months, this stabilization phase. When we get into what we call the monitoring phase or the recovery phase, if you will, this involves the ongoing treatment of your collections. They get moved around off-site to conservators, freezers, freezer trucks, back to conservators, back to you. What you're responsible for at this point is reestablishing control of the museum environment, and you're looking to reopen the collection, to reopen your facility. And finally, in this last recording phase, of course, this happens throughout the entire process. It's time to make sure your documentation has been up to date and implemented and changed into your system. You need to reflect and share the experience with others, and you may need some more long-term treatments and housing requirements. This is when you're going to know that. So before we begin, So BC Hearn developed this schematic of a workflow, and it's really quite charming. It outlines the processes we're going to go through, and it does it so in a bit of a zigzag fashion. And this is to remind you or to bring into your mind that the recovery and salvage process is not a linear process. It actually takes place over a long period of time, but you do more steps, several steps at the same time, or you'll come back to one step that you've already done. But the first thing you're going to have to do, of course, is a triage. And during triage, we assess the situation, we determine our salvage priorities, and we formulate a triage plan. During triage, this is when you get your first look at the actual site. So because this is your first kind of actual look at the site and requires a lot of planning, we really encourage you to resist the urge to start acting before you do your assessment. Just slow down a bit at this point, because you're going to want to start picking. Your natural inclination is to start to get your damaged materials out of there. So when you do your assessment, you'll want to check out how much of the area has been affected. Can you get into the area? Is it accessible? How much damage is there? Is there more damage going to occur? You really do need to make a full assessment. Also, during this initial assessment, you'll get information that you need to develop your strategy for recovery or for triage. When we say triage, it's a medical term, and it involves assigning a degree of urgency to wounded or to ill. Well, these are unique to individuals, but in this case, it's your museum or your specific situation that's getting triaged. But it is during this stage that you'll determine what to rescue first. You'll have salvage priorities based on value. You'll also have increasing vulnerability because of damage to part of your collection or all of your collection. You will also gather at this point information that will allow you to plan ahead to the various stages. You'll need categories and different requirements that are going to come later, and you need to get a good grasp of what those might be at this stage. When it comes to setting priorities, most institutions within their disaster plan have identified many high priority items or collections. They do it according to value, and they have different criteria by which they do that. But your salvage prior to that, so that's prior to that, but you'll come to it with your priorities already in hand. However, you have to add to those priorities, your institutional priorities, the condition of the item, because that impacts on how you're going to salvage. So if you're looking at what might be a high priority item for your institution, you'll also want to consider, is it badly damaged, or is it at risk of being more damaged? Is it beyond help, for example? Or is it just in the area amongst the other damaged areas? So as triage is unfolding and carrying on, you actually have to make sure that you track your materials. During the entire response, materials and artworks will be relocated several times. And it's really important that you know the exact state and location of all their parts and at all the time. Most of you will have registrars or archivists on your staff, or many of you hopefully are registrars or archivists. And the idea of letting materials be located and relocated several times probably gives you a little bit of a nightmare. So this is, you can probably concur that object tracking is a very, very important thing. We need to label and record materials that are parts of a file or a box and keep them together. We want to save the damaged labels or file folders, even if they're illegible, because they will in fact be useful in the time comes. The documentation that we're going to do throughout the salvage focuses on the materials and their movements, a variety of documentation. So it's important to ensure that materials have assigned a unique number. In fine art collections and in, of course, libraries, these could be a catalog number that's assigned to objects. However, often these things are the materials that we're dealing with are wet or dirty or fragile, and they can't be manipulated. And so therefore you can't actually sometimes see the catalog number. So it's better to begin with a new salvage number. These numbers can then be married up with the original number once all the dust is settled and you're into getting back into opening to the public. So you can assign objects with a tag, or in some cases even a self-adhesive label. Don't forget, at this point too, you're going to need procedures that are implemented and expressed to ensure that we have accurate tracking. You can track with handwritten lists or printed pre-existing forms, or maybe even barcoding is very common. This is an example of a tear-off labeling system that was developed in Switzerland, and it's actually a really good system for tracking files and books and and artworks. You can print these little tear-off labels on tieback or waterproof paper. They can be attributed to a single item or even a box filled with files, because it can be subdivided. So they're really useful for tracking the item through the entire salvage and recovery process. They tear apart, and slip A stays on the pad, and that becomes your main inventory log. The other remaining slips, B, C, and D, B, C track the movement and the activities that item will go through during the process. And the slip of D, it stays with the item, and then we can effectively make sure it's reintegrated into our system at a later date. So before salvage even begins, you have to physically, before you begin physically moving the collection, you must prepare the spaces. Okay, usually in the event, at the event site, the environment is unstable, or there's other recovery efforts happening concurrently, such as building recovery, and the collection material has to be moved, usually quite quickly, in order to be salvaged and recovered. So this is usually a location other than the event site. There's several considerations that need to go into what the spaces that you're planning, and each of them has validity. Don't forget, these spaces might be in-house, or they might be at a different location, or they might be in a truck, container truck that's brought up to your building. You can identify a lot of these areas for salvage during that triage phase that we talked about earlier. So you'll need a variety of spaces, and each of these spaces will have a prepared work surface. Hopefully you'll have your pre-assembled emergency supply kits, and you can prepare them by spreading out poly and covering tabletops. Maybe you've got some padding or bubble that you can set down, and you'll need a variety of spaces, some of them large, some of them small. Again, information you can glean during your triage phase. The most common phases, although it does depend on the type of institution, the type of disaster, and the type of materials, but the most common are you'll need a space for dry materials. You'll need one for partially damp and wet that are going to be air dried. You'll need one for wet to be frozen, wet to be kept wet. And you'll probably need something for contaminated materials. Maybe you want a place to clean some of the materials, again, during your triage phase. It's important to remember that you can use outdoor spaces if the weather cooperates, like if it's not raining, and if it's secure. If you're going to use outdoor spaces, though, remember that you have to cover to prevent sun damage. You want to make sure these items are in the shade, and you also want to prevent any dirt and debris and pest or bird droppings and things like that from landing on your wet materials. This stage is, if you're going to do outdoor spaces, and actually any spaces, it's really important that you beware You might have eager staff or intruders, contractors, and other people, who are walking through your area and who are doing their own business and not paying attention to your collection and your material. So security is a really big point, not just the risk of physical theft, but to physical damage due to other people. As soon as your spaces are set up, you're pretty much ready to start moving. But before you can do that, you have to support them and pack them properly, or you'll cause damage. It's at this stage, it's often where a lot of chaos ensues. So I just want to give you some caution at this point. You'll have chaos, and it's often difficult to control everyone's actions and enthusiasm. So it's important for everyone involved to know that the way in which you handle and move your items often determines the extent of damage in the end. So careful planning and handling, it might take a few extra minutes, but in the long run, you will get less damage if you take a few extra minutes at this stage. Be sure to label and record everything and take a lot of photos. All items, all parts at all times. That's kind of a model you want to go through. Usually you try to have one person identified as making sure we have records and labels and photographic records. Don't forget to assess the immediate surroundings, because some items might be stuck together. When you pick them up, they might be fragile or fall apart. And wherever possible, try not to actually touch the surfaces. We'll talk about that a bit more. So wet materials, especially wet paper, are pretty weak and fragile, and they do require careful handling. For archives, libraries, and some small fine art materials, you can make use of rigid supports, trays, cookie sheets, and plastic totes, things like that. You need to determine the proper support material that you'll need, so that when you go into the triage site or the event site with the appropriate support material, you're equipped to take that item back out of that space. Don't forget, it might be heavy now because it's wet, so you may need 2 people. But be careful, because a lot of times it's very misleading. And if necessary, at this point, you might want to carefully and lightly block some of the standing water you might find on the top of boxes in an archives, or you might find some water sitting on the top of frames and things like that. So at this point, you could carefully blot off some of that if you wanted. So whenever possible, you need to lift and support materials in the position that they're found in. And in particular, I'm thinking of a lot of times in archives and libraries, materials get pulled off shelves in disasters. And this, so imagine a book on an aisle floor that's wet. Well, you can't pick that up without a support, and you should never try to close a wet book, because if it's open and wet, closing that's going to ruin the paper for sure. You will get damaged. So try to support and move things in the position which you found them at the disaster site. Some other tips we can include are plan ahead, make sure you know where you're going, make sure you know which of the pre-assigned spaces that your particular item is going to. Try not to handle things if you can avoid touching the surfaces, especially soot and other materials are really ground into a wet or damaged art item. Your fingerprints or your handling can actually wipe off some of the information layer. So text on a piece of paper can be wiped off easily. So do be careful. Once the affected material has been removed from the event site and moved to like an appropriate staging area, you have to pack and repack in some instances. And what we're talking about here is usually the material that's going to get frozen. In this case, we're talking about books and paper. However, what you have to start with is to know that packing, if we're packing for freezing, you want to pack wet materials and dry materials separately. You want to make sure that you separate things from sticking together, especially if there's dyes from adjacent materials. You need to provide a little bit of air circulation. And some materials you don't want to stick together, like coated papers. And for those of you that aren't familiar with coated papers, I'm talking about the highly glossy, usually quite white, a little bit thick material papers that you find in like a magazine. Well, if coated papers get wet and aren't dried, are air dried, touching each other, they will stick together. Okay, so these need to be freeze dried, which we'll talk about. But coated papers are an alarming material to come across if it's wet. So we need to, as you can see in the picture, when we're packing our wet books and our archival material for freezing, we want to make sure that the books are placed in a box, spine down, and that they are, for moderately damp materials, that they are at least wrapped in freezer paper or wax paper. I've often used this butcher's paper that comes, you get it at the butcher, and it's kind of waxy feeling and it's brown. That works well. So you have to provide a separation layer so that things don't stick together in freezing. You need to fill the box, like I said, spine down, but the box should be full so that the materials inside don't slump. And if there's any voids, it's better for the freezing process if you crumple up some of this paper and put it inside the voids, okay, to make a nice firm box. That's for wet books. Now, the other material you're going to probably want to freeze for in the event of a water disaster is your archival material. And if it's still in its file folder and in its box, and those materials are wet, it might not be safe to take the file folders out of the box, and you'll want to freeze box and all. You can do that. You can put your archival document boxes right into another cardboard box. We recommend that 1 cubic foot is the largest box you go to if you can avoid going bigger. So this is these are the things that we're most often packing for, is things that are going to the freezer, like file folders and boxes from archival situations, or wet books. Remember that if you seal something in a plastic bag or tote, you will get mold. So you need to, that can happen usually within 48 hours sometimes, or even sooner. So it's a temporary measure. Use lots of freezer packages and freezer paper, to avoid the slumps. Don't forget to label the items as well as the box for freezing, and then set them aside somewhere so it's obvious these are the boxes that are going to the freezer. Okay? So when you don't want to stack objects when you can avoid it. However, things like the wet open book we discussed earlier, that should be taken away from the site on a flat tray or rigid support, and then put in a box with a layer of foam or protection. And if you have to put something above it, make sure there's maybe another piece of cardboard in there to give it a little bit of a barrier or support. So try to lay things, try not to stack if you can avoid it. So once the objects are supported and they're kind of packed in such a fashion, they have to be moved. This can be a really risky moment, especially for fine art collections. Moving from an event site for fine art really requires a bit more caution, because you're actually handling the item, whereas a book you're putting in a box and archival material is often in a box of some sort. Here, that's not always the case. So you need dedicated trained professionals. You need to do a thorough item assessment first, and very little packing at this point is available, because you're going to pack it more later on when it goes perhaps to a conservator or out for treatment if necessary. So don't forget to use, as we did with the other things, a variety of supports. But in here, this case, we're using like A-frames and U-carts or maybe dollies. Make sure you know where you're going. Talked about supports, and we've also mentioned labels a few times. There's, if you haven't seen Casey's second talk, great information on supporting and moving materials that are found in fine art collections, but as they relate to a museum collection, and I encourage you to watch that video as well. So stabilization and buying time, those are basically the goals of a good salvage operation. So implementation of some techniques actually allows us to buy some time. You need to have your collection fully stabilized. To have it fully stabilized, it needs to be fully cleaned, free of mold, and dry. If you haven't involved conservation at this point, now's a good time to bring them in, because you're going to be having to estimate and put in an insurance claim. A conservator is in a position to give you their information on what it will cost to salvage or treat after this is all over. To buy time, we can keep materials wet. This helps us prevent mold. And it's also a good option when you're waiting for freezing because it's delayed or it's not possible. However, not everything can get wet or should stay wet. The things that would benefit from staying wet would include sound and moving images, floppy disk, computer tapes, and photographs and negatives. That's if they're already wet. If they're not fully wet, don't wet them. And certainly don't wet out most fine art collections. Another technique for buying time is to freeze. Now, we've discussed packing of this material earlier, but freezing is a way to buy time. Not all materials can safely be frozen or kept frozen for a long time. So what we do is we freeze to buy time, and we freeze because organic materials will support mold growth, and we want to make sure that if it's not dried within 48 hours, this doesn't happen. So we freeze it to buy time. Don't forget that if you freeze something, you eventually have to dry it, whether it's air dried or thawed or vacuum freeze dried. There are several things you can freeze and several you shouldn't freeze. I think the most important ones are to talk about freezing that should not happen, and that's, of course, most fine art materials, any painted surfaces or paintings. Cased photographs are not good candidates to be frozen. That includes ambrotypes, daguerreotypes, and tintypes, glass plate negatives, and magnetic media. Often in a disaster or an emergency in a museum setting, you have objects that can stand to be cleaned. But in an archival or fine art situation, that's not often the case. It really depends on the type of water or the type of emergency. If you have a muddy water emergency, an upflowing river or that type of thing, perhaps there might be cleaning you can do. Or if it was a fire and there's soot, you'll want to do cleaning. But overall, as part of stabilization, it might be necessary, but it can be very, very destructive if not carried out with proper techniques. Of course, we recommend you see a conservator in this place, or better safe than sorry, don't do it. As a general rule, book and paper-based items should be fully dried before any attempt to clean them is made. Unless, of course, it's extremely muddy. But in the worst case scenario, some mud-covered book materials can be kept tightly closed and then gently rinsed under some cool running water, maybe a soft sponge. Archival material like sound and moving images, photos and negatives, those materials that can stay wet, those can also be cleaned. But do remember that wet surfaces are really susceptible to damage, and be careful not to touch their surfaces at all. This is particularly important if you're recovering from a fire where you have soot. Soot sitting on a surface is extremely I want to say misleading. If you touch a sooty surface and then clean it, it will be clean everywhere but where you touched it, because your fingers will embed that soot into the surface. So when you're recovering from fire, it's even more important not to touch the surface or the front of an artwork. So we've stabilized to some extent because we've packed for freezing, we bought time. Now we're going to dry the materials that are affected in a water event. Our type of method is going to depend on the materials that we have, the number of items, the resources meaning space, material, equipment, people, and of course funds. When it comes to drying, you have two options. You either dry it, air dry it, or you vacuum freeze dry it. Air drying is really good for small volumes of material. It's lower cost, takes up more space, and does involve more labor. You can set up a drying tent, like in the image on the left, where materials are set up, a plastic is draped over a table, and you're setting up air circulation like a fan to draw air through. Or you can set up your books. And if you have no tent, you can hang materials like on the right. Important though, don't add heat to drive up the process. And remember, with air circulation and dehumidifiers, you need to keep that relative humidity below 60%. When you go to air dry materials, let's look at books. Well, books, if they're normal size and in good condition, you simply open the covers and sort of, if you need to, span out the pages a bit, if it can hold it and not fall over. Then you can use paper towel and you can interleaf. You want to interleaf at least the front cover, and then about every inch or so, depending on the wetness of the book. These paper towels need to be removed and periodically replaced with dry ones. You also need to check quite frequently to make sure you don't have mold growing. Large and heavy, really damaged books, they need to go through the same process, except that instead of fanning them out, you're going to lay them flat. The other method to air dry, if you're not going to, for other materials, is to lay it out flat. So this is, of course, very, very consuming of all your leftover space because you're laying things out either singly or in batches. And it's also very easy to lose the order of materials. So it's very hard to keep documentation up to date and accurate at this point. The other problem is people walking through your materials, like we talked about with outdoor spaces. The people trudging through, whether they're well-meaning staff or other not involved, could definitely cause damage. When you're laying out to dry, don't attempt to separate the soaked or very wet machine or sheets. When items are just damp, you can sort of sandwich them between paper towels in small groups, maybe a light weight to help flatten. But for the most part, you need to have space between the stacks so you can get airflow. When you're going to air dry fine art, particularly paintings, you want to, I just want to say that when we're recovering from fine arts, when we did it with archival information and even library information, we tried to prioritize based on our collections as well as the condition. And in this case too, we want to recover based on, first, high value. Secondly, you want to go with least damaged. And thirdly, I'd go with slightly damaged. And the fourth would be, of course, the most damaged. So it's value first and then damage. When it comes to things like fine art that have this kind of value, it has to do with the recovery rate afterwards. First, be really careful. And if you have paintings without glass and the painted surface looks to be in good shape, you can actually place it carefully face down on a padded surface. And then if it's safe, take the frame off. Remove any backing materials to get at the wet canvas. Then you can cut some blotter that fit inside the stretcher. Don't remove it from the stretcher. Put the blotter in there and then maybe a little bit of lightweight. Make sure again to change the blotter, make sure your humidity is not high, and make sure you don't get mold growth. If you have artworks that are framed with glass, fine art and photographs, the same process holds true, except you'll want to be really careful taking off that glass. You need to get the glass off if there's any signs of moisture within that framing system. So I said earlier, if you want to dry it for your successful salvation, you either air dry it or you vacuum freeze dry it. And vacuum freeze dry, unlike air drying, is more expensive, but it's faster, does not require space, and does not require people. Usually it's a better security, less of a security risk as well. It's only applicable to libraries and archives, maybe some of your two-dimensional drawings and prints. It's not appropriate for photographs and negatives. Vacuum freeze drying is where we take an amount of wet material and we dry it in a vacuum at below 0 degrees Celsius. So the purpose of the salvage was to stabilize all our materials. Now that they're clean and dry, we actually have to recover them, because when they come back clean and dry, seldom are they ready to be accessed, used, or exhibited, because they're disfigured, they're distorted, or they're not in very good visual condition, but they're stable. So we need further treatment might be necessary. And we talked to conservators early in the process, and they gave us a quote on fixing this material. So we might be able to clean and repair them. We might have to rehouse many of our materials. We want to make sure that we change out boxes and file folders and things that got damaged. There's absolutely no point in keeping that material. And also, it's good to be aware of when to let go if the damage is too severe. Untreated damage due to this incident is a good reason to deaccession. Hopefully, you have a deaccession policy or a protocol in place. Consult a conservator, make sure that treatment's not possible, discuss it with your insurance rep, and make sure to dispose of items in a secure manner. At some point, new operation will resume, collections will be returned, and life will go back to normal, hopefully. But before it's already returned, you should make sure that space is clean, the space that had the event, is disinfected and free of mold. Ensure that the initial problem has been fixed, and that the environment is stable. Of course, you're going to have to update your records, your database, your locations, etc. I'm sure, like most of you, you're at home right now. So in light of COVID-19, I just want to say a few words. If you missed it, the AIC Connecting to Collections webinar, called Collections Care in the Age of COVID, is a valuable resource and can be accessed through the AIC website. There's tons of online venues for information sharing that you see popping up all the time. This is a time to ensure that your safety response plan is up to date, that your emergency vendors are up and running. Do you have emergency access to the, what if you had an emergency right now? Could you get in? Do you have supplies? You know, maybe make sure you're checking for insects and rodents on a regular basis, because this could actually be a problem while nobody's around. Make sure to document like an emergency, because we're in one. Take care of your health, your mental health and your physical health. And don't forget that CCI is available 24/7 for emergency contact. Reopening, it will prove to have some new challenges. The biggest one in our minds is to remember that and remind everybody that collections, materials, items, artworks, books cannot and should not be decontaminated like other surfaces. If you think there's mold or an issue, then you should contact a conservator on how to deal with that, or CCI. Remember to, when we get back to this, we're going to have to limit or stage visitors. We're going to have to maintain social distancing. We're going to have to make sure we have adequate supplies, etc. And this will be the new lifestyle. Thankfully, we're all in it together. I suggest you have a lot of resources available on your bookshelf. Here's a few that we recommend. Of course, online and the Canadian, online is a lot of information, and the Canadian Conservation is always available. Finally, the BC Hearn would welcome your membership. It does not require any financial consideration or contribution. We only ask that you have 4 things. We ask that you have a disaster plan in place at your institution, that you have some salvage supplies ready, that you've completed the training course and regional workshops that the BC Hearn is putting on, and that you desire to support others in the event of an emergency. Please contact the BC, contact any of us on this page, or check out our website at the BCMA webpage for the BC Hearn. Don't forget about CCI, and thank you very much for joining me today. Back to you, Lorinda.
Thank you so much, Tara. Just give me one sec here. That was fantastic. I do invite anyone to share their questions or comments using the chat or question and answer feature. If you are unsure of how to find the chat or Q&A feature of Zoom, you can just hover your mouse at the top or bottom of your screen, and the menu should pop down. Tara, we already have a question for you from Mary. What is the blotter you use when drying paintings?
The blotter I'm referring to, the most easily accessible or most readily available blotter can be bought at Opus or Michael's, and it's just an unsized cotton, usually based thicker than paper, and it's an absorbent material. You can buy blotting paper for a lot of art supply stores, like I say, and Opus, but if you don't have an actual blotting paper, there's other things you can use. You can use absorbent material, you can use towels, you can use, different things. Clean unbleached bed sheets can be folded up, and anything that's absorbing the moisture is what you're trying to do, is to get that moisture out of there. And once you've got most of the moisture out, then you just air dry with circulation to prevent mold growth.
Thank you. We have another question here from Fiona. Why do you start with the least damaged objects and move on to the more damaged rather than the other way around?
A lot of it has to do with what you can salvage in the long run. It's very dependent on the type of material and the amount of information we're talking. In a huge disaster, when everything's off your shelves, everything's on the floor, then you want to be able to, you're probably just going to be able to salvage and recover that which is not damaged. You're not going to have necessarily the resources to recover it if it's very damaged. Also, if it's extremely damaged, then your insurance will kick in. In libraries, you can rebuy a lot of your materials. In an archives, you might have a digital or a duplicate, a digitized version of that material. So it has to do with like the type of material and the value of the material, but also your insurance and the potential recovery of that material.
Thank you. We have a question here from Deb Thomas, which I can actually address. Deb is asking, is there a way to link this presentation for colleagues? It was very informative. Deb, everyone who has been registered for this webinar will receive a link to this webinar recording that will be sent out shortly following the completion of this webinar, as well as links to the previous BC Hearn webinars that Casey has presented for us as part of this series. It's a YouTube link, and that YouTube link can be shared to other colleagues so that they can watch when they have the time as well. A question for you, Tara, is from BV Museum. Does Hearn have resources/plans for assisting small museums that might not be able to use some of the methods or may not have access to the human power discussed at some different points?
Well, absolutely. The BC Hearn is in of itself a resource. We have, if you go on our website, it talks more about it, but we have people that we lead in different communities, like Anne up north. She would come to the rescue for her area and bring with her information, training, supplies as well. We have a small amount of supplies that we can take to small museums. And through BC Hearn, you have access to other people in your area who are trained. And that's one of our biggest selling features, if you will, is that we're growing and collaborating with these people, with everyone, to provide more trained people out there in the cultural sector and who are trained. So it's perfect for small museums. And I think that you would, as a member of BC Hearn, you would absolutely benefit from it should you ever have a disaster or an emergency.
Thank you. Is there any specific packing method for vacuum freeze drying?
Well, it's the same. It's very similar to freezing. I would consider it the same. Don't try to separate it in your mind. When you're freezing, the big thing is to make sure that there's some circulation. So you don't want the materials packed tight. You have to put freezer paper or parchment or wax paper in between things. The wetter it is, the more often you should put some freezer paper or wax paper. And it's a good question, because until recently, I did not know that if you take a box of wet books, or if you take a box of wet files and send it off to be frozen or vacuum freeze dried, the company will open your material and interleaf it for you if you haven't already done it. So if you don't want someone else touching your materials, you have to interleaf it at the time before it goes out. So for packing, for differences in packing between vacuum freeze drying and freeze drying, I wouldn't say that there's a difference. You need, like I say, some air circulation, some separation of the materials, and you just want to make sure that the materials you're sending for freezing are appropriate. Don't forget that vacuum freeze drying is not appropriate for photographs and negatives and some other materials, but those are the big ones.
Thank you. We have a question from Mary. Are there funding sources to help hire someone to develop the emergency plan for a small museum who doesn't have the staff time to do so?
That's a very good question. I would contact the Museums Assistance Program. Colleen Craig there could probably help you. And I think that, actually, I don't know. More than that, that's where I would start. I could also contact the CCI and ask them. If I find some, or after this, I will look up and learn that I will give you that information. You could forward it on to Mary Jo.
Absolutely. I can include that in our follow-up email so that everyone can receive that information. Wonderful. I'm going to leave the question and answer and chat function open it for people to add their questions as they think of them. I myself had a question. I just wanted to build upon the BV Museum question about smaller museums not having the methods or access for resources. And I was curious specifically about human power. For some of the things you mentioned, that this is something you need a partner for or to get assistance. For some museums that are very, very small that don't have other folks or may not have volunteers that would be able to come and join and assist. Are there considerations on reaching out to just general public to assist and things you should look for?
Well, you have to be careful about bringing in the general public because there may be some lack of training. There'll be perhaps lots of interest amongst your volunteers, your regulars, the people in your community. They'll want to help, but oftentimes untrained personnel can certainly cause more damage than not. And I want to harp on the BC Hearn, but don't forget, through the statement of cooperation that the 6 largest institutions did sign, you have availability as a member to conservators that can come and help. So we will work with staff to get rapid and safe response in emergencies, especially when they impact our heritage and cultural situation, our collections.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, it's really important to get training. I can't emphasize it enough. The other thing the workshops do, which I didn't touch on, is there's always a sense of chaos and panic during an emergency or disaster. And the workshops really alleviate some of that fear by letting you see what happens, by letting you try to recover. Like you participate in salvage operations and you see what it's like to pick up a wet piece of paper. So you have some of these experiences, and then you can take them back and train some of your own staff. So it's really coming to the next workshop that comes to your area would be highly recommended.
Thank you. We have another question here. How do you recommend disinfecting a space after a disaster?
A space,
excuse me.
Oh, a space, I'm sorry. As long as there's no materials in it, like no collection materials, you can disinfect it, much like we're doing right now under the pandemic we're currently in. You can use spray bleach, you can spray disinfectants, you can use bleach. Oftentimes warm soapy water with a little bleach in it is good. Vinegar on its own is great, like vinegar and water, just a little bit. But you'll want to make sure that you've got air circulation and no water. If you have air circulation and things are clean and dry, you won't get mold. If the humidity is below 65%, you won't get mold. So regular cleaning or cleaning afterwards could just be like we're cleaning our personal surroundings during this current pandemic.
Wonderful, thank you. I don't see any new questions coming in through the chat or Q&A function. Karina says hello. I just wanted to leave you some time, Tara, if you had any last thoughts or comments that you'd like to share before we wrap up.
Well, sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
Oh, these seminars, the 3 seminars we put on, our webinars and other materials are just meant as like an introduction and to get you thinking about these kind of things. It's timely in light of the current situation, but it's to get you thinking about these or to maybe be a refresher in some ways. It hopefully sparks you to go home and put together a grab-and-go bag or to look into some of the things. Really think about what would happen if you had an emergency right now at your institution. Could you safely protect, collect, or correct or stabilize your collection right now? Would you have the resources or the know-how? And I think take advantage of the fact that we're not there to really think about what would happen if we went through this. And I see there's a comment here about earthquakes.
Yeah.
And that's the thing is there's lots we can do in our current situation, or sorry, in our storage and in our collections that would help prevent or reduce the risk of potential damage. Things like earthquake mitigation, putting things down, anchoring support and furniture, that type of thing. And then putting things in boxes, especially archival materials, processing your materials, and not leaving unprocessed materials on the shelves open to any possible events. I think the other thing is just be calm, go slow, and know that there's help out there.
Thank you. That's a wonderful place to end with those thoughts there. Thank you so much, Tara, and everyone for joining us. We really appreciate your participation and look forward to keeping in touch. Thank you so much. I certainly have learned a lot, and I really appreciate you joining us, Tara.
Thank you, Lorenda. It's been my pleasure.
Oh, thank you. Please mark your calendar for the next webinar we have coming up in May. Wednesday, May 20th, we'll be exploring power tools, creating a blueprint for recruiting, revitalizing, and recognizing volunteers. And remember, if you have any suggestions for topics in 2020 or wish to present one yourself, please email myself at programs@museumsassociation.bc.ca. We'd love to know what topics interest you. There will be a follow-up survey coming into your inbox following this webinar. Please do fill it out as it assists us with our webinar development. And lastly, if you are not already a member of the BCMA, please consider joining us and staying connected. And also, if you're not a member of the BC HERN, consider that as well. For the BCMA, your membership benefits include free webinar participation, as well as access to all previous recorded webinars, reduced registration fees for our annual conference, regional workshops, and other events, access to Prodi resources through our website, including Roundup Magazine, regular e-newsletters with up-to-date grant opportunities, job postings, and much, much more. More information can be found on our website at museumsassociation.bc.ca/members. Thank you so much again to Tara and for everyone else for joining us today. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon and take care.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.